Welcome to EBCC News at 9:12.
Oh, fuck.
Welcome to EBCC News at 9:13. Starring Mrs. Butters. Oh shit, I forgot you're saying it. Welcome to EBCC News at 9:14. Starring Mrs. Flores. Yeah, girl, break! John, the pimp daddy. Gentry, the confused. Edit the beginning.
We could just like leave it on
The entire time. Because
Yeah.
that's how the do this.
so you get this.
Welcome to EBCC News. Now.
I think you have to speak louder. You have to speak louder for it to hear you. No? Or
Oh, this is a practice moment.
Yeah, this is. I'm gonna edit the beginning.
I should have brought some shades, but it's midnight.
Stop laughing. Stop.
Get it together, baby.
Okay.
Come on.
Come
on, pack
say it.
secrets,
Put it in your mouth.
Okay. Okay. On today's news, we're talking about solitary confinement. You already know.
Damn, it's gonna be a lot of editing,
I know.
So should we start off with like the definition?
Yeah, I almost started.
Yeah, should we start off with the definition?
Hold on, just cut. Cut that shit. I'm gonna cut that shit out, cuz we fucked up. We're trying to make it funny. we're gonna fuck up. Somebody
well,
tell
the
me
debate is gonna debate what?
I
We're just gonna go.
if it's right or wrong.
Alright, we'll just like
On the
start
information
going
page,
against each other. It doesn't matter who.
Okay.
Okay.
Ready? Start.
Oh, you already started the time?
Yeah.
5 minutes. 10 minutes. It's gonna be 10 minutes and that shit.
Wait, do I start with the today? We're gonna be talking about
Yeah,
everything.
sure.
Okay.
Let's get it.
Today we're gonna be talking about solitary confinement. You already know.
So solitary confinement is the housing of an adult or juvenile with minimal to rare meaningful contact with others.
Solitary confinement is a practice in federal penetrated through two remedies: administrative segregation and disciplinary segregation. Their remedies differ in purposes and procedures. Okay. The disciplinary segregation is limited to a maximum of 30 days, but administrative segregation can be indefinite. The aspects of administrative segregation has come under public through high-profile causes and inmates being held in solitary confinement for years and forever. Kind of. Administrative segregation is a controversial remedy that indefinite prolonging solitary confinement in federal inmates.
Solitary confinement may violate constitutional rights of prisoners. In North Carolina, 4 prisoners have filed a class action lawsuit alleging that solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment and should be considered unconstitutional according to the Charlotte Observer organization. Filed by the American Civil Liberties Union and North Carolina Prisoner Legal Services, the lawsuit says that the 4 inmates and others were held in cells smaller than the average parking space with little human contact for 20 2 to 24 hours a day. Prisoners in solitary confinement are at risk of serious psychological and physiological harm. Allegedly, solitary confinement does not rehabilitate prisoners and ready them for re-entry into society, but is virtually guaranteed to inflict serious pain and create or exacerbate mental illness. They come out sick, angry, socially withdrawn, and even more likely to wind up back in prison.
Some comments seek that to clarify how the trial decision is dealt with is one key issue. Does it require firm time limits for the duration of solitary confinement? It all depends on the case and in which the verdict has reached.
More than 4,000 prisoners with serious mental illness are being held in solitary confinement. According to new research, despite the knowledge that holding people in solitary exacerbates mental problems and can even trigger them.
According to a social psychologist named Craig Honey, says there is no evidence that administrative uses of segregation have any positive effect reducing or controlling gangs in prison. For example, the California prison system has had one of the most aggressive segregation policies, segregating gang members in the country, and continues to have one of the most serious gang problems.
Wasn't that right, Pip Day?
Police officials should use solitary confinement only as a last resort and for the shortest duration possible when there is no other option to address or imitate safety threat. But today in North Carolina, thousands of people are confined in tiny cells and denied human contact, sunlight, and fresh air for over 24 hours a day. For offenses as minor as using profanity, these policies must end too.
Pretty strong points. Prolonged solitary confinement is defined by international law and solitary confinement. It exists for 15 days, maybe depending. The United Nations Standard Minimized Rule for the treatment of prisoners from the Nelson Mandela Rule. You know who he is. It prohibits prolonged solitary confinement under the rule against treatment that amounts to torture and the cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Both corporations of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association v. the Queen and the British Columbian Civil Liberties Association versus Canada accepted these rules as non-binding international norms that inform constitutional analysis.
So is solitary confinement considered torture? Yes, prison isolation fits the definition of torture as stated in several international human rights treaties and thus constitutes a violation of human rights law. The UN Convention Against Torture defines torture as any state-sanctioned act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for information, punishment, intimidation, or for a reason based on discrimination.
A study by the Association of State Correctional Administrators estimates that as of the fall of 2017, 61,000 people were held in solitary confinement. Nearly 2,000 of those prisoners have been held in isolation for more than 6 years. Data from this study also indicates that more than 4,000 inmates who suffered from serious mental illness were kept in restrictive housing.
Suicide is another major concern in one study of California's prison system. Researchers found that from 1999 to 2004, prisoners in solitary confinement accounted for nearly half of all suicides. A 1995 study of the federal prison system found that 63% of suicides occurred among inmates locked in special housing status, such as solitary or psychiatric cells.
Section 12 for the cruel and unusual punishment. The decision both held that the current remedy does not violate the guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment. Under Section 12, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they reasoned that while segregating could violate Section 12, such violations were not inevitable and to be accessed on a case-by-case basis. However, two decisions differed from Section 12, their analysis and the prolonged to solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement wastes taxpayer dollars because it is much more expensive than housing people in general population. This is due to the cost of constructing and operating single-cell confinement units, enhanced security technology, and additional correction staff to handle escorts. Searches and individualized services, not to mention the increased healthcare costs from significant medical and mental health symptoms that develop or worsen in solitary confinement, as well as expensive hospitalizations for incidents of self-harm.
Adaptations made by prisoners while in solitary confinement may affect their mental health upon their release back into society, which could increase the risk to public safety, according to a study by the University of Michigan Journal of Law and Reform. This is a risk of prisoners and inmates there'll be a risk to society.
According to the social psychologist Craig Honey, solitary confinement is harmful and there is no evidence it works. There is no evidence that administrative uses of segregation have any positive effect, reducing or controlling gangs in prison. I already said that.
Sorry, Marco.
It's almost time, 20 seconds.
20 seconds.
Okay.
20 seconds. Any closing statements? That's less than 20 seconds now.
Wait. Yeah, no,
Solitary confinement is fucked.
What about what is being done to end solitary confinement?
Yes, we'll end up with that.
Yep.
Well, with this?
Yes.
Well,
What is being done to end solitary confinement in the U.S.? Prisoners and their families have taken the lead in making the public and policymakers aware of this cruelty taking place in the U.S. Correctional facilities forming coalitions and working to ensure their stories are told in the news media. Several faith-based organizations, including AFSC, have accompanied survivors of solitary confinement in calling for an end to the practice. Politicians and other public figures such as President Obama, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, and Pope Francis have denounced long-term solitary confinement, while the U.S. Senate has called for reforms from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons.
True that.
It's time for a lunch break now.
Next on EPCC News, the debate. John the Pimp Daddy. Oh shit. Next on EPCC News, the debate.
He's saying that shit out.
So what are we debating?
4 against, but
Okay.
And they were against it.
Reasons to be for.
did you find something?
So y'all gonna go already?
Oh wait, we're looking for something.
Positive. Just kidding.
Positive. Cut.
Cut. Cut that shit. And that's a wrap. That's how we should end it. I don't know. I'll end it at the beginning.
my drink that water. Alright, so this is the NFL show. Today we're talking about Pittsburgh Steelers. You already know. Just kidding. Mm-hmm. 8-5. You already know we're going to the Super Bowl for 30 teams.
I just say this so yeah. Okay.
And then fuck the Cowboys.
Oh my god.
Because that's his team.
They're 6-7. How the fuck are these in the playoffs?
Mm-hmm.
Anywho.
5 minutes.
Okay, so our opening statement is solitary confinement is the housing of an adult or juvenile with minimal wait.
That's the
Should
definition.
we do that? The definition and then, or do I skip that? And
Breathe, we only got 5 minutes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, those in solitary.
Alright, start over. What the fuck?
Okay.
Alright, I'm going for real for this time.
Okay, those in solitary confinement often experience sensory deprivation and are offered few or no educational, vocational, or rehabilitative programs. Different jurisdictions refer to solitary confinement by a variety of terms such as isolation, administrative, protective, or disciplinary segregation, permanent lockdown, maximum security, supermax security, housing, special housing, intensive management, and restrictive housing units.
First of all, let me tell you something.
Very strong points.
Those are some weak ass points.
Alright.
Solitary confinement, we should have that shit. You know why? Because inmates.
Some may be dangerous than others. So the whole point of solitary confinement is to keep the most dangerous so limit this to society in which they won't be so dangerous. So that's a basic point on having solitary confinement. I'm not sure about the whole entire cruel and unusual punishment because I never heard of any. I have 3 uncles that are solitary confinement.
Shit, I just came out of that shit.
They do get the same services as people upstairs, but the only thing is that they don't have communication data outside and they don't have as much freedom as other prisoners that are upstairs.
It's true, personal experience. Experience that shit just came out last week. And
You
look at
came
me.
out of it and you're still for it?
Of course. Let me tell you why though.
Okay.
Because it set me straight. I'm right here doing a news report.
They admit to that.
Mm-hmm.
God is good.
I'm right here doing a news report up in this bitch. Alright, let's go.
Alright, well, it creates a loss of freedom. So basically, how is like putting someone in a room without other people around, like, okay for their sanity? Like, as human beings, we need like contact from other human beings to be safe.
Mental hospitals have the same thing, right? Why isn't that considered solitary confinement? Why?
Well, because they're getting cured.
They're getting medicine.
Are they really getting cured though?
I really do.
Were you
Yeah.
cured?
Yes, I was. Been in that shit. Personal experience. And now I'm here doing a news report. Mm-hmm. Take it away.
How'd you get out? That's my question.
I like it. Don't
We feel
question
sorry.
it.
We feel sorry for him, so we took one.
I got my ways right. But all I gotta say, closing this statement because we almost out of time. It's another lunch break.
We have a minute.
Solitary confinement is better than the death penalty.
Oh, that's a strong point. I'm sorry, really. Wait, is it real?
It is. Who wants to die?